Laura Jadid, I've read your piece about this and your feelings about this. And as I mentioned to Rachel, I also saw your writing indicating that in 2010, when you were in Afghanistan, this is the way you thought this would end.
Yes, Lawrence. And I don't think it was just me. I think almost everyone there could see the writing on the wall at the time. My unit was sent over to train the Afghan National Army and police, and the 82nd Airborne Division doesn't know how to train people. They know how to smash things, and they're good at it. And what we ended up doing was just doing all the work and saying that they'd done it. And I know we weren't the only unit doing it. And I just don't think that we understood the country well enough to establish anything permanent.
And Laura, you write that the choice at this point was stay forever or get out now. There was no third choice.
That's correct. I mean, this was always going to happen. The only question was when. And the best time for this to happen, if it had to, would have been many years ago. But the second best time is now. So although it breaks my heart to see the images of the Kabul airport, and it breaks my heart to think of people like Cowboy, I still think this was the right thing to do. And I'm glad that we're out.
Let's listen to what President Biden said today about the pace of the evacuations and why the evacuation process didn't start sooner.
I know there are concerns about why we did not begin evacuating Afghan civilians sooner. Part of the answer is some of the Afghans did not want to leave earlier, still hopeful for their country. And part of it because the Afghan government and its supporters discouraged us from organizing a mass exodus to avoid triggering, as they said, a crisis of confidence.
David Rothkopf, I want to give you a wide open space for your reaction to what the president said today and what we're seeing in this final exit of Afghanistan.
Well, I think the president said what needed to be said. It may not have been exactly what his critics wanted to hear, because I think they wanted him to own the problems of this week in a way that satisfied them somehow. But I think he did that. He explained why things had gone amiss. The Afghan government folded. The Afghan military folded. They were not there to slow the Taliban. The Taliban accelerated their process. But what we're seeing right now, the horrific images that we are seeing in Kabul, they're not the consequence of a decision that was made in the past several weeks or the past several months. They're the consequences of 20 years of bad decisions by 3 other U.S. presidents, by military leaders who spent a lot of time trying to cover their reputations, by misleading about what was possible. And Joe Biden is the first president out of the last 4 to say no more. He knew in 2009 when the Obama administration did their Afghan review that it was time to go. Laura knew it in 2010. You were talking to Rachel. She knew it. I wrote an article in 2010 and said this was a failure. And yet here we are 11 years later, and nobody until Joe Biden had the courage to say enough. No more lives, no more spending. This is an Afghan civil war. They're going to have to resolve it for themselves.
Let's listen to one more thing the president said about the Afghan troops' willingness to fight.
Here's what I believe to my core. It is wrong to order American troops to step up when Afghanistan's own armed forces would not.
Joe Cirincione, what we heard the president say today about the Afghan government and its collapse, the Afghan military's collapse, is a pretty reasonably accurate description of exactly what happened in Saigon with the South Vietnam's government and South Vietnam's military. When the Americans left, the military collapsed, the government collapsed. It was over.
Yeah. I'm so glad you played John Kerry's quote, because I was thinking about it all day today. How do you ask a soldier to be the last person to die for a mistake? And the Afghan war was a mistake. The president got it exactly right. The initial narrowly focused mission was the correct one. We accomplished that. But everything after that has been a failure, a massive strategic blunder, one that has cost us tremendously. And how can you ask Americans to continue to sacrifice for this blunder when we saw today and over the past few days the complete collapse of the government, the complete collapse of the military? This was not a Taliban military victory. This was a political victory. They took Kabul without firing a shot. They swept into these cities by having discussions, by paying bribes, by winning over the warlords of these provincial capitals. And the reason they could do that is because the government that we spent so much money equipping and supporting was corrupt, incompetent, and hugely unpopular. No Afghan soldiers were going to die for this government. How could we ask American soldiers to die for this government?
Laura, when you were there, what was the kind of the military literacy in its own history and the Vietnam example? Were members of the military using the Vietnam example to explain what they were going through in Afghanistan?
I think the Vietnam example was in everyone's mind. You could see it happening again, but it certainly wasn't something that was talked about on any kind of officer or oversight level. I just don't think that the military ever really learned the lessons of Vietnam. It was not something that we ever really talked about. I would like to say that I do think what Joe Biden said about the Afghan troops is a little bit unfair. The Afghans are some of the toughest and most tenacious fighters on the planet. It's just they didn't want to fight for the government we gave them, which is the same thing we did in Vietnam. We claimed we wanted to give them a choice, and they could have any government they wanted as long as it was the one we wanted for them. And we made the same mistake, and now we're seeing the same thing.